Canadian defense policy has two imperatives and one choice. You must defend Canada, you must defend North America, and everything else is a choice, which makes NATO a choice.
NATO is a choice. Yeah, we're going to dive into that more deeply. Our guest this week on Now and Next, retired Major General, RCAF, and former Director of Operations at NORAD, Scott Clancy. And his view of NATO has been affected somewhat by Prime Minister Carney's new worldview. Here's our conversation with Major General Scott Clancy. Scott Clancy is a retired Major General of the RCAF, spent a good 37 years in the service of this country, and finished up his career sitting in the seat of the Director of Operations at NORAD. Joins us now. It has been a while since you and I have talked. A lot has changed, but probably only to the extent that the last time we really talked about security issues around the world, Scott, things have intensified more based on the discussion that we have had. I go back to a year or so ago asking you, is the world a more dangerous place with Donald Trump in the White House? Your unequivocal and quick answer was yes. Could you have seen it be this bad a year ago?
Absolutely not. And I think that every news station around the world has had an anchor at one point in time push back from the table and said, never in my wildest dreams would I have thought that the red lines of behavior, comportment, alliancemanship, diplomacy would have been crossed by this administration in this fashion. Venezuela, Greenland, 51st state, all of it. And not to mention the internal dissent of democracy and respect for the rule of law that's happening inside the United States, which is impacting their international things just as poorly.
You get into the whole culture, the change in that posture internationally and domestically. And I was talking to David Schultz last week. He's the professor of political science and constitutional law at Hamilton University. And he and I have talked about this over the years, but it seems to be we're coming to this punctuation point where it looks as though we are watching the end, the demise of the American century. Your thought on that?
Well, it was an interesting, I listened to it. I thought it was a great conversation that you had, and he provided some really interesting insights with respect to power, not just power from a pure military might power, but in terms of it, how it relates to influence around the world as being the real dictator of the American century, as it was. It's a powerful paradigm used often by political scientists and international relations experts to, see the ebbs and flows and try to put some order to what is the chaos of the international sphere. I'm not convinced. And some of the reasons why I'm not convinced is even though all the world powers seem, post Davos especially, but seem to be shoring themselves up, both economically from a trade relations point of view, but as well with their supply chains, to being more independently minded and everything else, they're still, especially in the Western world, canted over towards the United States. And if Canada had to make a stark, hard choice between China and the United States, it's very clear where we would have to land. And the power of the American economy is not necessarily diminishing. I take what Dr. Schultz said, as it pertains to the cultural power of the United States waning. I think that's been on the go here since, probably prior to the events of 9/11 and the global war on terror, but significantly their cachet around the world has been waning that way. But just because there's a descent back into the Monroe Doctrine years of, more isolationism, I don't necessarily think that it's the demise of the American century or the rise of the Chinese century. I think that it's going to be more complex and complicated than that. And I think that Russia would want to have something to say about that.
I want to get into the China question here, but and you cited Davos. Let's go back to, sort of Mark Carney planting the flag figuratively and literally in many respects in terms of where Canada stands vis-a-vis the New World Order. He frightened a lot of people by using that terminology. But a week out here, and I look at it in terms of the economics of it, but the security issues, it all kind of blends together in the discussion, such as it was, or a debate around what was going to happen with Greenland, the Arctic sovereignty issues that you and I have talked about in the past. But to me, I think the criticism has been either it's been too binary. That is to say, well, Carney wants to go it alone, or he has to be in bed with the bad guys. And I think it's far more nuanced than that. And I think that's reflective of the way the European Union has responded to Trump and China and Russia, for that matter, and in extending that to NATO. That there is an understanding that we can't do it without the Americans, but we can't do it exclusively with the sole support of the Americans. And I think they both can be true.
You and I have spoken about the two truths being true at the same time and being able to hold two truths. And I think that the phrase balance, and that balance is a lifelong thing, like whether it's in your personal life or your work life, whatever it is, you try to achieve that in a long-term way, not just in short-term things. I think that Prime Minister Carney took a page from many leaders' books, throughout history, saying, we're going to make a stance here. I want to be seen to be leading in the world because Canada wants to lead in the world. And that's the power of our economy, especially as it relates to the small size of our population and the size of our territory. But at the same time, he's walking that fine line, knowing that CUSMA negotiations are coming up, that we are tied to the American economy intimately, that our supply chains will continue to be linked past this. I think you're absolutely correct. It's much more nuanced than that. I think that Mark Carney, beyond anyone else, saw that leadership piece as being essential. That if the middle powers in the world, based upon this, call it New World Order. I like to say that we're back to the realpolitik of great power competition that for Russia and China never went away, but we just kind of ignored for the last 30 years while we focused on the global war on terror. Those globalization elements are still fundamentally essential to Canada and its economy. But to be able to lead means that that's a way in which Canada uses the Davos platform as a fashion to be in economic negotiations with Indonesia, India, China, Australia, the European powers. And it's, we in stark contrast, we look at the speech of, the rambling, I don't want to say lunacy, the rambling attacks of Donald Trump the next day, but even more, Lutnick walking from room to room being just, bombastic in his rhetoric around Davos, as part of the delegation from the United States that was there. That's the easy comparison. The hard comparison is you go Carney, Macron, Trump. In all of that, Macron is only being seen internationally as the guy who wore sunglasses at his speech at Davos, whereas Mark Carney is saying things that the rest of the world is picking up. And it's not even Canadian and American press that you need to read. Read UK, European, Italian, Australian, Asian press. He's being seen as to lead that in the world. I think it's going to be very beneficial for Canada. Funny enough, in the heels of this, Aaron O'Toole wrote an op-ed piece as it pertains to what Mark Carney did not say. And I think that it's honest in its comparison, and it's very laudatory about the leadership piece, but it leaves out the fact that, hey, we saw this coming. Canada's been ignoring its defense, security, supply chain, development of industry and infrastructure for 40 or 50 years. That's something that we should have gotten after. You left that out of your speech, Mr. Carney. I think that's a valid thing too as well. So Canada standing strong is not an independent or other thing. It's going to be about that balance that I think you're absolutely right of those two truths.
The whole idea of that, the targeted audience, Davos, was international, and I agree with Aaron O'Toole in terms of, yes, you kind of got to get your own house in order, but that's a domestic conversation that I think, Carney's willing to split that hair and say, okay, at home we're going to have this discussion, and rightly so, to say, okay, this is all really great. You put the flag on the map, you move things forward, and at the World Economic Forum. Now, what are we doing about it? And whether that is in terms of our military spending, our Arctic sovereignty issues, the main questions around housing and affordability, all of these things now require action. So where do you think the priority has to be to make sure? Because I know you've talked at length about the challenges of saying, it's great, we're going to put a big dollar out here and say we're going to commit this amount of money, but the actual mechanism and the ability to execute that order and vis-a-vis the spending, and as far as military is concerned, far more challenging than perhaps any other portfolio. So what do you think has to happen first here to see that we're on the right path to taking that action that's going to make a difference?
Well, yeah, and I'm going to answer that, but I'm also going to say that I think you're absolutely right with respect to the audience, with respect to Davos and then Canada. I was as pleased as Mark Carney's speech at the Citadel, that he gave around his caucus, beacon and bastion, the things that need to be done. I was as inspired there because that was to the Canadian audience. So yeah, and I agree with you. The audiences were very specific, and he had planned both of those speeches before he left. Yeah. So what do we do for defense spending to signal to me that we're actually serious about this? Well, I think that the naming of Minister Fuhr in terms of modernizing the acquisition programs for defense and security is a fundamental step forward here, but it's going to be overcoming the public service pedantic approach to how taxpayer money is spent and fair and equal competition and the bureaucratic stopgaps that are in place there that are preventing any kind of innovation, any kind of real development, any kind of speedy movement with respect to defense acquisition. That's going to be the first thing, because if you can't overcome that, because right now, talking with my friends who are in the public service or in the Department of National Defense, there's this angst from the Prime Minister down to the soldier. Absolute alignment. Move quickly. Spend for Canada. Spend in Canada. But spend on defense. Develop real operational capability. And the public service follow the exact same guidelines that we have developed for 40 years for a slow competition, that if you even have an idea right now, it'll be 10 years before you can field that. If they don't solve this, prior to anything else, and the submarine deal is going to be, one of the things that Minister Fuhr has taken over here. If they can't accelerate on that nature, then there's nothing else that's going to really happen. So that's the first thing. Second instinct thing to me isn't going to be the announcement of procurements. It's going to be the growth and the expansion of the Canadian Armed Forces. To be clear, you add more and more capability to the Canadian Armed Forces, you need more people. Real defense spending, 50% of the defense spending is on the personnel of the Canadian Armed Forces. If you don't expand the Canadian Armed Forces, its actual numbers, and they're having enough problems right now because of the choke points with respect to recruiting and training, the front end load of the force, then that's not really solving the problems. They have to be willing to make hard operational and strategic choices as it pertains to the manpower of the Canadian Armed Forces, or else that expenditure is just going to be flash in the pan. You're not going to be really supporting it, and you're not going to be fulsomely delivering that capability. If you take a helicopter squadron that you say needs 1,200 people and you only give it 4 and you say, just work with that. Imagine what you get as a result. We've been living this reality for 30 years. And you also have a leadership within the department and the Canadian Armed Forces that has been incentivized for decades in saving and cutting. There's a real difference in your approach to leading organizations where you're going, we just have to work within what we have, and we're not going to spend over that, and we're going to spend less, versus being bold, aggressive, innovative. And those are two different mindsets. We do not have the senior leadership inside of especially the department that is focused on those abilities and those judgment techniques as leaders.
As you talk, it sounds to me as if this is you take out a couple of variables, and this is a similar conversation that we're having around pipelines, where we all realize that there is a need, there is an economic reason to do this, there's a security reason to do all of these things, but we get bogged down in consultation. We get bogged down in that kind of process of getting the job done, as opposed to saying, I hear you, now here's what we're going to do, and acting on it. And in fact, it may be more complicated than some of the pipeline issues based on the way you've described it.
Yeah, for sure. And I think there's a direct parallel. I think you make a very honest look between the two. I will tell you going back to two truths that can be in the place at the same time. All of this work is very, very tough. It's complex, and it takes real leadership to push through. Okay, so just rolling over indigenous nations with respect to pipeline and saying, yeah, heard you, got the consultation, we're going to do what we want anyways. That's really not the answer. And we all know that, right? And it's the same thing on the defense side. Just saying that we're going to willy-nilly allow the Department of National Defense to purchase things without oversight over taxpayer dollars in the billions of dollars, that's ridiculous as well. So you have to be able to achieve that balance and understand where that risk lies, and then be able to overcome this. Here's the crux. And it comes back to leadership. Not that I love bringing everything back to leadership, but at one point, there's going to have to either be compromise or forced compromise. When parties come to the table and they're this far apart, and you just say, well, then we're just going to go on strike and we're going to make things worse. And you're going to work through that angst. You're going to try and bring people close. But at one point in time, it's going to go like this. And the leader's going to have to say, yes, this is what we have to do. And he's going to have to explain it to the nation. The thing that I think Mark Carney has the ability to do beyond the other leaders that we've seen, and I would have loved to have seen Aaron O'Toole in the same space, because I think he's got that same quality. Speaking directly, transparently, explaining the complexity here and bringing it down, and then making a decision and then standing by it. Good and bad. And I think that this is what Canada needs right now from our leaders. So I think on the defense side, the last indicator that I would be is, I love NATO. I think NATO's a great organization. Not my bag. I'm a NORAD guy, and all Canadian defense policy has two imperatives and one choice. You must defend Canada. You must defend North America, and everything else is a choice, which makes NATO a choice. It only defends North America as it pertains to what that alliance is going to give back to us. And from a pure defense in North America point of view, we're lacking here. So my last bastion, or the signpost with respect to Carney doing the right things, is the actual advancement of the architecture required for defending North America. F-35 is a piece of this, but it's not the major piece. OTHR, polar OTHR, the over-the-horizon radar systems that are going to sense, and the evolution of Canada's participation in or out of Golden Dome, but developing integrated air and missile defense capabilities. These are the things that I would say, okay, now you're signaling the right things. I might even add into there, Canadian enhanced participation in the North, and how we advance Arctic security in that realm too.
You bring up the F-35, and to me that sounds very much like a really good example of this paralysis in terms of the conversation. We had the deal, we got it signed, and now we backed off of it, and now we're debating whether or not to go forward with it, whether or not we should be adding the F-35 as suggested, or do we go with the European jets that we're entertaining? The idea of having two different aircraft in the fleet, and or whether or not the priority is NATO, whether the priority is North America. That, to me, is the pointy end of this conversation. So,
if and you and I watched the news, Ambassador Hoekstra was bombastic again with his comments as it pertains to NORAD, the future of NORAD, if Canada does not buy into the F-35. It's like dealing with kindergartners on the diplomatic side, and he really doesn't know how to read a room, and I don't think he cares much about what Canadians think, and that's a problem, because it's just inflaming what is actually three debates that are going on at the same time. Look, the F-35, we say that, hey, we're re-looking at this, and the military is re-looking at this. Military is not re-looking at this. The military is giving the same advice that they've been giving since the beginning. The F-35 won the contract. fair and square. Can we work with the Gripen? Okay, but that's like telling the military, if I give you an order, will you follow it? Yes, sir. Yes, ma'am. And then we move on. That's not the same conversation. So there's no enhanced debate going on inside of military circles. Commander of the Royal Canadian Air Force, who I've spoken to personally, they are focused on one thing. The F-35 is the best aircraft. And by the way, for parents out there, just imagine trying to tell sons and daughters to go into combat and saying, you know what? The F-35, you all would have come home, but 2 out of 3 of you are not. But that's because we bought the Gripen and we said it was better for Canada. Really? Think it's better for those pilots? And we're back, right? Especially if it's not achieving the aim to protect everybody else, like the F-35 is. But that's a one debate that's going on. The second one is this NORAD integrated air and missile defense and Golden Dome participation. It's not a national versus not national thing. It's about being a good ally. It's about being able to align with those imperatives of defense policy. Canada has to stand and be able to defend Canada. And the best way to do that is in partnership with the United States. But the best way to do that in a circular debate is to be strong in Canada first. And that's why, committing to the programs like the F-35, because it's the best aircraft, to over the horizon radar sensor systems and point missile defense systems. These are things that are good for Canada. But it's the CAN-US relations thing that is the third thing optic that's bloodying everything. Oh, if we buy the F-35, that means we're with the Americans. What? Back to your comments with respect to Carney's balance. China, Europe. Okay, well, he's visiting China. It's as much a signal to the United States. And I like Dr. Schultz's, approach with it. It's as much a signal to the United States and how Canada's going to achieve that balance in being an autonomous and sovereign nation on its economic and supply chain initiatives. But it's not necessarily a rapprochement towards China and away from the other Occidental powers of the world, especially the United States. So, but it bloodies the waters where everybody sees things. We're either with the Europeans in Gripen or we're with No, that's I wouldn't want to fight and die on all or nothing kind of things, because as you wall up behind those debates, you give people like Hoekstra the fuel to that fire. So that's kind of how I see through the murkiness of those kinds of things. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah. And I think that's my issue with this entire, discussion, the forum for the debate, is that it has been, I go back to it being binary. I mean, you've identified 3 different areas, and so it even complicates things all the more. It's either you're with me or against me. And I just think that in that context, you use the word, the idea that we're going to have to somehow kind of compromise. In the American terms, that means somebody loses from their perspective and the way they're actually negotiating. So I think to see the field properly, have a peripheral vision of this, that is, the Prime Minister talks about, sort of the values and realism kind of coming together here. This is the challenge for us politically. I think it's the challenge for us in terms of how we run the government, as you've described it already. And I don't know how we correct that vision, because we go back to, an earlier conversation you and I have had some time ago, and all of this, again, will come down to the priorities and the perspective of the Canadian public. I know you're not a pollster, but, I think the way you aligned it up with, you want a strong Canadian security and armed forces and sovereignty, and everybody puts their hand up and says yes. Okay, but what are we giving up? Are we going to give up education? Are we going to give up our multiculturalism? Are we going to give and all of these things? And all of a sudden, the priorities, as you've articulated them, get pushed way down or get watered down. Probably is the better way to put it. So that's another field that we're going to have to consider playing this game on.
So yeah, not only a field, it's the fundamental one. Because that dialectic debate that you talk about, where, you're either with us or you're against us, the hold up between the liberal, conservative, Democrat, Republican, hawk, like whatever it is, education support or not, like you're either in support of healthcare or you're not. You're either willing to make defense spending the number one priority or you're not. Those debates, they're not going to be beneficial, but being able to navigate that in a transparent way in which Canadians can say, okay, talk about concessions or, it's going to be real sacrifices as it pertains to, I think, transfer payments and or debt load for this nation to do the things that Mark Carney wants to do. To be clear, and I think you and I talked about this when they said, hey, we're going to go to 2%. Can they just get there by cutting? No. What about 5? No. Like the answer is just no. Double defense spending, by 2030. Yeah, no. There's only 2 ways to do this. You're either going to cut the transfer payments to the provinces, which is, a significant load for the federal government, or you're going to put the nation into further debt. Those are the only 2 ways. If not, trying to compromise the social safety nets or the healthcare or education systems of Canada to be able to get there is compromising the pillars and foundations upon which the nation is actually going to push forward with how it wants to be. And defense is just one of those pillars. You take out education, you don't have an educated workforce, and all of the stuff on defense falls apart. You can cut this in many ways. Navigating that, like you say, this is the political goal. Many Canadians that I've spoken to, even after Ukraine, even after all the rest of this, we're going, why are we sending any money anywhere else when we can't service our people here? And I'm going, wow, what an evolution, because it's kind of where the American, mentality is. Why are we spending all of this over here when we need that help back here? Repatriate everything. There's a danger there because the unquantifiable things are the things that come back to end nations. Deterrence is a real thing. That was the money that I was trying to play with on every day. And instead of it being a major business deal, I was trying to create the idea in the head of Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping. And let's just not mention that North Korean guy, but anybody else, that if on any given day they wanted to do something bad, not only were we ready, but we were also ready and we were going to retaliate. We knew where they were. We were going to see it. We were going to be able to deal with it. And that deterrent element is unquantifiable. So when the Canadians see these big price tags with respect to defense and security, especially, or even infrastructure, as we have to build those kinds of things, they're going to come with real sacrifices. And trying to explain that to Canadians, Mark Carney's the best person to be able to do this. What I'm concerned with is that the other parties within Canada turn this into what has, we've seen in the United States, either from the left or the right, where it's always taking political advantage and we get further apart, as opposed to saying we are all here wanting a strong Canada. Hey, we believe in 2% GDP. Yes. Okay. Then let's work together. That's good. That's good. I take issue with that thing. I think that's working together. Our founding forefathers charged the leader of the official opposition, because that's what the Governor General does, with presenting the opposing point of view with a vision to making the plan stronger, with a vision to making policy stronger, not in order to force government to fall at every instance. Those were not the ideas that our founding forefathers put in place in Parliament. And I hope that Mark Carney is the leader that can navigate those transparently and speak often enough, frankly enough, to the Canadian people where we can see through that political bluster to real leadership that'll bring Canada forward.
Yeah, I don't want to get too far down the rabbit hole in terms of the opposition in Ottawa, but I will only say that the response to Davos, I think, has been measured, and I think it has been proper, and I think it has been thoughtful, and maybe a little unexpected based on the previous posture of Mr. Poilievre. A couple of things. I don't want to keep you too long here, but I'm reading, this idea that it was a piece in the Economist a couple of weeks, last week, I guess, just after Davos, and it's as if Europe, they're suggesting, is going through the stages of grief in terms of their relationship with the Americans. And I laughed as well. I thought, okay, that's an interesting way to put it. But it's coming to this realization similarly to the way Carney articulated Canada's role in the world vis-a-vis China, Russia, U.S., that NATO has to have the same kind of discussion, no? I mean, we can't be talking about NATO in terms of the way it was, formed and founded 60 years ago.
The evolution of NATO has been a real interesting thing. I mean, I joined the military in 1984. We're in the midst of the Cold War. I studied nuclear deterrent policies and, crisis command of the coming nuclear war. We had significant forces stationed, living their families in Germany to counter the Warsaw Pact at the time, the Soviet Union's, specifically. And it wasn't until, I finished my education that the wall fell. We entered a small period, and then 30 years of the global war on terror. That NATO at one point in time was concerned about the size of the Atlantic, not physically, but figuratively. And the whole idea here was, what ties the United States to Europe in a conflict that risks global escalation? This surrounded the deploying, came to a head with the arguments and debates surrounding intermediate nuclear forces forward deploying from the United States into and around Europe, ostensibly with NATO, but realizing that nuclear command and control never leaves national chains. Let it be what it is. The problem there is that, many people in Europe go, if the Americans can conduct a limited nuclear war without touching their homeland, why would they ever involve anything on an escalatory measure? They'll fight this over here. And this was, how do you tie those elements of the Atlantic across? Now, I think that, funny enough, the debate's kind of gone the other way now, where everybody's going, will the Americans come to your aid? But what's Europe doing for me as well? Right? Like, if there's a major attack on North America, the morning after, Europe's going to wake up and ask for Canadian troops to deploy to Europe because NATO's declared Article 5. And if we said, well, no, we were attacked, so we just want Germans to come here and help our air defenses, the answer is nobody's coming, right? Go talk to your American brethren, which should raise questions in Canada's head as to, what is it that NATO's actually giving us from a paradigm point of view. This is a great debate. What I've not seen so far is a willingness from either the NATO leadership, and we watched him have a very uncomfortable conversation with Donald Trump at Davos pertaining to Trump's comments that, NATO troops just kind of sat in the background and weren't on the front lines and, haven't done anything for us lately. And when it comes to the 600 plus soldiers that were killed during the war in Afghanistan, that's a slap in the face to all NATO countries. So I think there's a real debate coming here, but it is going to be more foundational. And what you're seeing out of the NATO leaders, either individually as nations or as NATO as is they're not willing to confront Donald Trump and his ego specifically, because if they do, they're too worried about what that repercussion is, either to their organization, NATO, or to the economics and the trading stuff of their specific countries. And they come in tariffs that will be, implemented without care, without thought, egocentric, driven by the cult of personality of Donald Trump. And I think that there's some fears there. Funny enough, Carney, the only guy that's willing to, without specifically mentioning the United States, being very clear as to what the problems are of being the food on the table, as it were, inside of that. So I think that NATO is going to have to come to a holy grail moment. I think that the European Union and its potential military arm and military operations may be a counterpoint to what NATO has been doing. But I think that we wouldn't wanting to play the long game, because NATO is a very strong alliance in terms of its cohesion. It's the comments that the Americans have. They root straight to the nuclear backstop of America, underpinning the deterrence of Russia, China, and other world actors to undermine the Western way of life. And that's going to be a problem, because cohesion is really founded on things that are inside of your head. And the number one thing is trust. So I take a lot of this back to the stuff that I write on leadership, but Charles Feltham wrote, my favorite part on trust, and trust has 4 distinctions in it, and it's care, competence, sincerity, and reliability. When the United States looks at the rest of the world, sometimes they go, I don't really care about that. I don't really care about that. Okay, that's telling. But in the same sense, I'm not sure how many Europeans really care about America, to be clear and honest. So that's an issue with diplomacy. Competence. The United States is going, we're the competent global power. We have we've been fielding the backbone of the command and control architecture, and NATO is guaranteed by the United States of America. And it can keep on going. Their global combatant commands facilitate all the alliances around the world. And by the way, it's the same in NORAD. So that's kind of a one-way street. But then when you go to sincerity and reliability, everybody else around the world, especially now after Venezuela, after Greenland, after the 51st state, is going, we can't trust you. And anything that we have, any alliance we have, we don't believe that you're going to actually be there for us. So there's no trust. And without trust, these alliances and the cohesion with them, they fall apart. And the only people, remember that Russia and China now in this info war era, they don't have to do anything because they just want the unreliability of the United States to be the going theme that is heard worldwide.
Yeah, I mean, Russia and China were gleeful on the sidelines as we watched what went on vis-a-vis Greenland. I mean, without question, without doubt. But just to be, I just want your take then on that the final outcome around the conversation on Greenland. My sense is that it's not over, but that the NATO and European Union leaders asserted themselves to say, you can't do this. We'll figure it out, because he came away with a deal where there was no deal for Trump that was anything close to what he was demanding. But the other side of this is, and again, we go back to the international and the domestic side of this, the markets in the United States also played a role here and said, what the hell are you thinking? We're not doing this. So it required that, again, two sides of this, both can be true at the same time, elements to move into what might be some level of stability? Question mark.
Well, in all, and Dr. Schultz would probably be better positioned to comment on this than I am, but in all political structures on the international sphere, Thomas Hobbes said famously that it's the state of nations on the international sphere. You can think that you've agreed to a rules-based order or these international institutions and international law, but in the end, it's what you can enforce. And if someone flaunts it, then if you can't enforce it, if you're not willing to use coercive power, military, economic, political, if you're not willing to use coercive power to counter it, then there's no repercussions. If there's no repercussions, we're back to the state of nations.
Right.
So what Greenland showed, to your point, international, domestic, he's very transactional in his things, but he's also pragmatic in terms of being a businessman. There is going to be no real, this is the rules of this new game. That's why I think it's going to be much more chaotic. In the realpolitik of geopolitics, prior to the world wars, especially, this is what played out. It's what you can enforce. It's what I can take. It's what I can trade. And I trade with you out of necessity, not necessarily out of need for globalization. Now, yes, we're into a different sphere because of the last 50, 80 years of global economics and supply chains. However, the rules that underpin those have just gone. And I think that instability and unreliability is migrating everywhere. What that means for Greenland specifically, because, the last order on that, no, I don't think it's over. I don't think it's over because U.S. hegemony, if you can't get it one way, but I want it another, then I'll just go about that other way. This goes back to the art of the deal and who he is with respect to how he wants to make those things. Venezuela, not in the news, but, when I got woken up that morning with, come and talk to us about this because this happened, I go, oh, good gosh, because now you do this, there's a lot of fluster and bluster and it's all about economics, but I haven't seen very much movement with respect to oil companies going down and investing in Venezuela. The elements and tenets of the old regime remain in place, including their control over the population and especially the journalists and civil free speech. So what has actually changed? What has changed is everything became more unstable. That's it. It's just inserting that instability. And in that instability, and this is the only kind of theory that kind of holds true, is this is what O'Bannon talked about. This is what Trump was talking about prior to his election, is flooding the zone, going after everything means that you can't focus on any one thing. Just being in Minneapolis, feels like a civil war. Dr. Schultz. Yeah, because that's what he wants. Everybody rocked back on their heels, and the only one seemingly in control is the people that have the power and can wield those things. I think and markets, they might be fluctuate on one day, but then he just goes, okay, I'll just go a little bit slower. And then he goes slower about that game. I don't know. There's not many people calling him out on the specific policies, right? They're calling him out on you can't do this or you can't, but they're not willing to sacrifice their nation's economics, tariffs, or their political futures based upon it.
Yeah, well, and of course, you talk about sort of flooding the zone, and now the headline today as we speak is, they're talking about another shutdown of the government, which will be a complete and utter distraction from everything else that we've been talking about the last half hour or so.
Absolutely.
So Scott Clancy, Major General, thank you, sir. It's always great to talk to you and get your passion and insights on this stuff. Thank you.
You're very welcome, Dave. It's really great to talk to you as well.
All right, and that will do it for this edition of Now and Next. Thanks to Scott Clancy, as always, and he always has great insights into sort of that 100,000-foot view. Of course, considering he's a pilot, he would have a pretty good view from up there, but of how things unfold. Just a reminder that the complete episode of Now and Next are only audio. It's only audio. Yes, we do some video, and you can find some of the highlights and some of the chapters of this episode on my YouTube channel. You can look it up. It's Dave Trafford Podcasts on YouTube. And we nail some of that down. So if you've got a thought in terms of how you want to react to that, feel free to do so. You can email me, dave@davetrafford.com, or check us out on YouTube, or go to my Substack. That's new, and it would be great if you could subscribe to that, and we can create community there as well. And be good to have your feedback on what you think in terms of what's coming next, based on what's happening now. It's Now and Next. I'm Dave Trafford. Enjoy your week.
Pay no attention to that man